This video is near and dear to my heart, and will probably be one of the few times I dip into my personal life. I did engage in some minor embellishment to tell these stories, but I wrote this immediately after speaking with a handful of my family members. The dialogue I reference is paraphrased from the conversations I had. As it turns out, my family has a long, quiet history of UFO encounters. I just discovered this past couple of days. If you've been looking at my channel, you may have noticed that I haven't been at this for long, just a couple of months. The truth is, I still haven't told my family what I've been up to. This is weird stuff, and there's still a ton of stigma attached to it that even I am not immune to. I did tell them the truth, most of it. I told them that I've been writing about this stuff a lot lately, and once I disclosed that, they opened up about their personal experiences, and I couldn't believe my ears. I'm going to recount their stories now. There's 3 encounters I want to tell you about today. The family members who have recounted these stories to me want to remain anonymous. They just never spoke of these things over the years. They all occurred at a time when retelling these stories would have labeled them a kook, and they had jobs and families to attend to. 2 of the stories left my uncle stunned and fearful. Now before I continue, I want to thank everyone who has subscribed. I'm having a ton of fun making these videos, and I know you are a small crowd, but this would not be near as fun without you. Thank you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Moving on. This first story, I can guarantee you that it's true. It's the story that convinced me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that UFOs exist, they are visiting us, and they are under intelligent control. I know it's true, because the man that recounted the story to me is my father, a man I've come to respect beyond reproach. He's a man of integrity, and if he says it happened, it happened. You can take that to the bank. It was the summer of 1974, the year Stephen King published his debut novel, Carrie. Richard Nixon had just been forced to resign after the Watergate scandal. It was the final weeks of July, and my mother and father, who had married just a few years prior and had just begun building a family of their own with the birth of my eldest brother, were cottaging with my aunt and her fiancé, my future uncle, whose story I will tell you shortly, on a popular lake, Black Lake, just outside the National Capital Region of Canada in the province of Ontario. I grew up swimming and fishing in these lakes. The memory of the feeling of seaweed clinging to my legs when treading water is one of my fondest, an experience most people recoil from, but I always found it soothing in some way. I spent so much time swimming in these lakes that swimming in a pool with its chlorine soup is just foreign to me, and you'll never catch me in a public pool. I recoil from those pools like one would recoil from the feeling of seaweed clinging to their legs. Anyways, my father's story. It was the wee hours of the morning, 2 or 3 a.m. on a night brightly lit by the moon and stars. My aunt and future uncle woke my parents up to show them something they had been watching over Black Lake for some time. My parents stumbled out of a small cottage they were staying in and stood on the shores of the lake in stunned silence, staring up into the night sky. A craft was hovering silently over the lake, projecting a bright light down onto the surface of the water. As my father was recounting his experience, I asked him flat out what it looked like, and he said, sounding a little sheepish, "Fox, it was a flying saucer." He said, "You know the Calgary Tower, right? It looked to be about the size of the top of that tower and in a similar shape." He said, "I watched it for a good half an hour. It hovered over the center of the lake about a mile away from where your mother and I were standing and shone a bright light down, which illuminated the entire craft." He said it did little to nothing. Then, in a blink of an eye, he said it skipped off, bouncing out of view like skipping a rock across the surface of a lake. He said numerous people must have seen it. It was a busy lake, and late summer nights are the best nights for stargazing or just drinking 3 too many beers around the campfire. He had expected the incident to show up in the local newspapers, but nothing ever surfaced, and he quickly got caught up in life and hardly spoke of it again, until he recounted the story to me just recently. Now, I have vague recollections of them mentioning this before, but it was always, "I saw a UFO." Everyone would chuckle and we would move on to more mundane things. I never imagined that they had had such a stunning encounter. The second story involves my uncle, the one who woke my parents up that night at Black Lake. He remembers a long night of playing cards at my grandparents' kitchen table with my aunt and my parents. They would play canasta until late at night, enjoying each other's company. After a long night of cards, he said he and my aunt retired to the center bedroom of my grandparents' small home around midnight. It was a room that I was very familiar with. It was in the center of the house, and I had spent many nights sleeping there. It was an unusually hot night in August or July of 1986, and my uncle was unable to sleep due to the heat. He woke my aunt and said he was going to head home to sleep in air conditioning because he had to work in the morning. He did not live far from my grandparents' family home and got into his prized 51 Mustang and started the short journey. He was driving north on Shanley Road and suddenly saw an extremely bright light. He knew he was coming upon a busy train track and immediately thought it must be a light from an oncoming train in the distance. The light moved over his car and he started thinking that perhaps it was a helicopter. The light suddenly changed and he said it was immediately bright as day, brighter. He pulled over and drove up a farmhouse laneway a short distance and stopped and looked off into the trees. He said there wasn't a single shadow. Despite it being around 1 a.m. in the morning, everything was completely silent and brilliantly lit. He said suddenly his entire body shivered and every hair on his body stood up. He wanted to get out of there so bad, so he pulled back onto the road and took off. Putting the pedal to the boards was his words, but the light was persistent. This is where he says his memory starts to fade. He said he remembers seeing a community baseball diamond in the distance and slammed on his brakes, scared, sliding his Mustang about 100 feet, and then just as sudden as the light occurred, it stopped. He said he couldn't see a thing, like going into a dark room after spending a long time in the bright sun. That's the last thing he remembers. My father, when recounting his Black Lake story, told me he put me in contact with a friend of his in the States who has an abduction story, and I mentioned that to my uncle. He went silent, then said, "I haven't told anyone this, but I do wonder what happened after I saw that baseball diamond. I can't remember anything. I couldn't remember anything then, and I don't now, and I wonder if maybe I was taken. All I remember is skidding to a halt and looking at that baseball diamond, then waking up in my bed." He said the odd thing is, when I got into my car in the morning, the heat was turned on, blasting. He said no way would he have done that on such a hot night. He said, "I prefer not to remember, but I haven't seen anything since, but have followed the phenomena throughout the years." He said he contacted a UFO investigator from Winnipeg and that they had asked if they could share his story, to which he declined at the time, but if they ran into anyone with a similar story, he'd want to talk to those people. My final story is perhaps the most astounding one. What my family saw that night scared them silly. It involves another uncle of mine in the same geographical region as the other two stories, this time just south of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. We're not sure of the date. My uncle had a small painting company that he ran with his son. They had worked late on a project in Ottawa and were driving home south on the 416 highway around 11:30 at night. His son, sitting in the passenger seat, suddenly said, "Dad, look at that plane, the light, it's coming in low and fast." Focusing on the road, my uncle didn't pay much attention and continued their journey south in their old panel van, somewhere near Spencerville or Kempville, Ontario. His son, watching the light come closer and closer, began to get scared. "Dad, it's going to land." Perhaps he thought he was watching a plane crash in real time. "It's going to be right on us," he said, as they watched the light go over their vehicle. The following is insane. I would not recount it if I had heard it from anyone else. You can say what you want, but I believe my family. He said, a craft landed on the highway. It was so large my uncle described it as reaching ditch to ditch. Now this was before 4-lane highways were constructed along that route, so the craft must have been around 40 feet across or more. 2 lanes of highway, ditch to ditch. He said he saw what looked to be every color of the rainbow, like mixed paint poorly stirred together and dripping off a saucer-shaped craft. His son, scared silly, ducked down and hid under the dash of their truck. My uncle, not knowing what else to do, started inching his truck towards the craft when it suddenly and silently zipped off into the distance. He said it was like 4 clicks. 1 click, it was instantly a 1/4 mile away. A second click, it was a 1/2 mile away. The third click, a little further still, and on the 4th click, snap, it was gone. My uncle told this story once to my other uncle, the one from Black Lake, and never spoke of it again. I have never asked him directly about it and was told never to. The experience had frightened him. He was a grown man, proud and industrious. He couldn't explain what he and his son had witnessed that night, and was not about to subject him and his family to the ridicule that comes with retelling such tales. Like I said at the onset, I've only been at this for a little while, and these types of stories never came up until just recently. You can believe what you want, but I believe the men in my family because they have never led me astray and have no reason to, whatsoever, to make up stories. These were true stories. You can believe what you want. I know they're true. I know we are not alone, and I know we are being visited by an intelligence not known to man. Perhaps this will inspire you to bring up the topic with your elders. You never know what stories lurk in their pasts. Thank you for listening. If you like my work, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. And remember, this ride is not without risk. Be careful out there, and take care.